Here's Us on the Raggedy Edge. Welcome to So Here's Us on the Raggedy Edge. I'm your host, Matthew Broyles. This is episode 5, and with me is author, songwriter, raconteur, man about town, Mr. Mark Doyon, and calling in from the great state of Virginia. He and I both have a lot of things in common. One of which is that at this very uneventful moment in history, we both decided to release books. And so his new one is called Deep Fried. It's a novel. How would you describe this book, Mark?
I suppose I would say that it's absurdist fiction. It is contemporary. And it is kind of tragicomic in nature, existential focus.
Yeah.
And it's a story that, I would think, might make you laugh and maybe cry a little bit. It's
a very, I feel like it's a very 21st century piece in that it takes place in a food truck lot, which I think is an interesting setting for a thing. I actually play a lot of food truck lots as a musician, so it was kind of
okay.
There's this chain of places called the Truck Yard down here where it's just a collection of food trucks with like a central hangout area, and I play those.
Oh, right.
But
great.
So it's interesting to kind of see the perspectives of the food truck owners, and of course they have very different personality types. As the story unfolds. But this is actually am I correct? This is your second book?
It is the second book.
Okay.
And I think you may be familiar with the first book.
I'm very familiar with the first book.
Because there's a really good audiobook version that was narrated by Matthew Broyles.
That's correct. So Bonneville Stories came out. Well, I know the audiobook we did in 2011. I'm not sure when the actual book was published. But it's a decade or so past. I guess probably for the folks listening, should kind of fill them in on like how we got together. So like I remember back in 2004, I was looking around on Stonic Bids, which was still a thing then. I guess it may still be. Saw that there was somebody doing a Warren Zevon tribute album. And I thought, hey, that's pretty cool. So I sent in my version of Mohammed's Radio, and Mr. Mark Doyon was the one who was producing it and curating it. And that ended up coming out. It's called Hurry Home Early. I like to tell people that there's two Zevon tribute albums. One of them has Springsteen on it. I'm on the other one. But this one though, the one that you and I did, actually has Zevon's son Jordan on it, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it does. I mean, he's actually on both of them, so they kind of both got his blessing.
So that's pretty awesome. And then you graciously agreed to release my second album, February, on your Wampus label, which was very cool. And that was the first time that anyone had ever actually taken an interest enough to release any of my stuff apart from me. So I thought that was a cool thing. And then I did the audiobook a little bit later. And we've all been doing our crazy stuff in the meanwhile betwixt. I think it's kind of interesting that we both came up with books coming out round about the same time. Just I guess felt like a time to throw one out there. I don't know.
Well, it actually kind of started that way because you mentioned 2004. Mm-hmm. Because I had a record that was one of my more important records, or more, I guess, ambitious records that came out that year, and that's where I first heard of you. Was everywhere that my record would get reviewed, it would be next to this record called Texas, which was by the Matthew Show.
Right.
And I didn't have any idea who that was, but I noticed for some reason it kept like popping up because I guess we released them right around the same time.
Yeah, that's funny too.
And so, not long after that, I think it was your follow-up to Texas. That's when, we went ahead and released February, which, I wanted to break in and just say that's a record that doesn't really, in my opinion, age.
Oh, well, thank you.
I think it's a timeless, fantastic record and one of my favorite records.
That's pretty
and
awesome.
One that I will pull out when people are over and say, check this out.
That's badass. That gives me the warm fuzzies because I'm one reason it's like that is because I'm really terrible at following trends. So anything I make is not going to be whatever the trend is at the time. So I don't. I'm not currently making my Olivia Rodrigo album. So it's just now I would be, if I were able to do that, that would be pretty cool too. But I don't have it in me. but yeah, it is interesting because that actually happened to me a few times. So when I had a band before the Matthew Show called the Civilians way back in the deep dark 1990s, and when we put out our first EP in '98, it always got, and on CD Baby, it always said, if you like this, you'll probably like Nathan Hamilton. And I was like, oh, Nathan Hamilton, okay. And then years later, I ran into Nathan Hamilton, and I was like, hey, you and I keep getting put on the same stuff, and all this. and so we ended up working together on that. When I did the tribute record for my buddy Jason Jackson, he did a tune on it, and saw him at Folk Alliance back in 2012, and I loaned him my fiddle player for that gig. So he's a really cool dude. But yeah, there's kind of these. I find that there's some kind of these odd little orbits that I bump into people in, and you're one of the people I continually bump into, and I think I think whatever it is that we're orbiting is a very interesting little celestial object. And I don't know.
Yeah.
Because
I definitely recognized that pretty early on, and so it's just there's always I'm always kind of keeping an eye on what this Matthew guy's up to.
Well, same thing. Anytime you're putting something out, I'm always kind of curious as to what it's going to be, because I think you and I have the thing where I think we get bored when we do the same thing for too long, and so we'll kind of go, I don't know, let's just try something else, And so, you throw something out there, and maybe it sticks, maybe it doesn't, but at the very least, it has kind of stretched a little bit of your creative fibers a little bit.
It's healthy.
I think it is, and I think it's also, it's difficult, in these times just to be a musician, because it's, the pay on that can be kind of dodgy. But also, I think it's good to diversify not only from a commercial perspective, but also from just a you learn something either way. Because like when I did that Rewired radio play last year, and I learned so much from that I'm applying to the new album, and I think it kind of made me a better engineer, which is always helpful. Because I'm old enough to remember when it cost a lot of money to be a good engineer, because you had to have all this stuff that was big and bulky, and I had to have somewhere to put it. Right. And and I don't have that much space. So thankfully we're living. I tell people this all the time. The era we're living in, it's the easiest it's ever been to make an album in your house. But that, of course, means that everybody's doing it. So the hard part is sticking out.
And the truth is you can spend any amount of money, from a little bit to a ton of money.
Oh, yeah.
to make an album. And
I've done both.
The fact is, your songs will be exactly as good, regardless of how much you spend.
Well, and it's interesting because I've found it just gives it a different vibe. So, like, when we were recording up at Ardent Studios in Memphis, and, they recorded Led Zeppelin 3 there, and, Gin Blossoms and all this stuff. And really, at the end of the day, it still sounded like us. But it sounded like us through a particular lens. It was like, this is what we sound like through this, like, Memphis style studio lens. But it still sounds like us. And so but I'm just as proud of the stuff that I just made in my house, because that still sounds like me.
And like you said, I mean, if you kind of develop as an engineer, and you get to a point where you can make very good sounding records,
Well, you
really don't need to go somewhere where it's, expensive.
Well, and I've also, that there is a benefit sometimes to go into those places to learn also, just to like watch these guys and see what they're doing and ask questions and be like, hey, so, I see how you're miking that snare there, I mean, it's kind of figuring out little tricks and stuff so that you can take them home and mess with them yourself. And, learning from guys who've actually been to school for this stuff and have actually produced people. We did that Jason record with John Hampton. He was one of the engineers on Big Star's record, and like he, had produced everybody. And, it was so funny, like the day after I finished mixing with him for that record, he was posted on Instagram. He was hanging out backstage with Jack White or whatever, and I was like, okay, well,
wow.
So I guess he was slumming with me a little bit, but
it's all slumming.
Well, I know, but that is actually one of the kind of magical things about Memphis, though, is that there's a lot of rubbing elbows between the small people and the big people, and that's something I feel like that a lot of towns don't have, and it's kind of a special place. There was a bar that I went to, like up 2 blocks from the studio, and they had this family band playing, and it was like, the 13-year-old was playing the drums, like 10-year-old was playing the keyboards, whatever, and then they had this 90-year-old man who was the grandpa who was playing saxophone, and they were all just destroying the stage, like really amazing. And like, these were all like relatives of all these, studio session guys. And I went to play this coffee house up in Covington, which is a little bit north of Memphis, and the guy who owned it, I didn't really know who he was. I had booked him through a friend, and he goes, hey, for the second set, do you mind if I sit in on harmonica? Now, a lot of places that I've been to, open mics and whatnot, when somebody says that, that's the big old red flag. You don't want that, because you don't, this is just a guy that's going to honky honk honk. But I was like, well, this is your joint, so sure, you can come play. And this guy, he was an old Memphis session player, and just one of the most amazing harmonica players I've ever seen. And he's going to town on my tunes. I'm like, okay, well, that was a good idea. So, you never do know who you're dealing with.
Oh, no. I mean, well, there's an endless number of permutations, I mean, all the different people you can work with, all the different ways you can approach everything you do.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have enough time, but we just kind of pick the ones we have time for.
And that's kind of part of the deal, because, I still have, and I will have, I'm sure on my deathbed, I'll have a giant list of stuff of like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if, and not going to get to all of them, but, I try to do as much of them as possible, especially the stuff that I think is unlikely. Like, like what if I asked, so-and-so to play something on this? And, sometimes you ask and they say yes. And
yeah,
it was actually you that got me in touch, because I was on that Zevon record with Robbie Rist, got him to guest on February, and kind of got to know him a little bit. And he's, for people who don't know, he's been a number of things. He was Cousin Oliver in the Brady Bunch, which was entertaining. And then he was also, I think it was Michelangelo in the 90s version of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and has been in movies, and he was in Sharknado, for Pete's sake. Guy's been around, but he's also a fantastic musician. And so it's kind of cool to just know people like that and just bump into them through strange circumstances. I actually, back when Texas came out, I got put on this compilation album that Oasis, which was my CD duplicator, they put out just a compilation of all the people who'd put out albums, with them that year. And I was right next to Rick Astley. And I thought, I think I need to put that on my promo material, like I've been included on an album with Rick Astley. and I occasionally would think to be like, I wonder if I got in touch with him. It's like, have Rick Astley come and do a guest vocal or something. I think that would be pretty cool, actually. I never have done it, but I might do it at some point. I don't know what I would have him do.
Well, from what I've seen of that guy, he's very responsive to all kinds of attention.
He'll do anything, yeah. So I mean, which
if you contacted him, he might be up for it.
I might, yeah. That might actually. Well, I don't know if you check out Rick Beato's YouTube channel, but he played this trick where he put out a video. The title of the video was "David Gilmour Won't Appear on My Channel," and so not a month later. Of course, David Gilmour's people call him, and now he's on the channel. So it's like, I see what you did there, So that's what I need to do. Is I need to, Rick Astley won't appear on my album, and then be able to get Rick Astley on there. And sometimes those combinations are interesting too. Like Toad the Wet Sprocket just put out an album last year, and they got Michael McDonald to do a guest spot on it, and that's one of those I would never have thought to mix Toad the Wet Sprocket and Michael McDonald, but it worked. So, I don't know.
I mean, sometimes those things are the best. Yeah.
The stuff that you wouldn't figure. Well, like one of my favorite albums, I swear, is when Ben Folds and William Shatner did that album, Has Been.
Oh, of course, yeah.
I thought that was fantastic. Like, that was way better than it had any right to be, And so it's just like, okay, fine then, that's great. But so I'm curious now, getting back to the book, because of course I can digress for hours. So with the deep fried, I guess what was the thing that kind of sparked the setting and the character of Arjun, the main guy in this story?
Yeah. Well, I mean, deep fried is, I hesitate to use the word fable, but it essentially is that. It's kind of an allegory, where, I kind of came up with this idea of, kind of a situation that represents something else.
Yeah.
And really what the book is about is, the community of artists and what they do in the world. And the reason I made them all food truck chefs is because these are people that make sustenance to nourish other people.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And so the idea is, why not, actually literalize that, and talk about art as if it was food. Because it is. Our art is food.
Yeah, and that particular character I totally got where he was coming from. Where he was like, he was going to do it the way he was going to do it, whether or not it was particularly popular or not. He was like, this is the stuff I like to make, and I want it to be really good. And
exactly, he comes up with this this kind of strange concoction, which really no one is asking for.
Right. Yeah.
And I think this is like
you can see why I identify with that.
Thing, like, right, like artists will tell you about this all the time. They had this great idea.
Yeah.
But no one was asking for it.
No.
Yeah, and that's part of art. It's like you do something that nobody else thought of, and it may or may not be something that other people need to hear. But
right.
People will rarely ask for anything that they haven't heard before.
And that's the other thing about it too is, and this is kind of where I've always been, is that as a live performer, someone who's in, bars and restaurants and whatnot, and I think people think that they want to hear things they've heard before until they heard something that they haven't heard, and then they go, oh wow, what was that? That's pretty cool. And but the default setting is, well, I know what I like, so I figure I'm just going to listen to what I like, but you don't ever have and especially as you get older, I mean, we kind of ossify sometimes into the stuff that we have liked in the past. I try super hard not to do that, and thus my playlists are, of course, all over the place. From stuff that came out last week to stuff that was back in 1968 or whatever. But what's interesting about that? That's the thing that I've noticed with my daughter, who's Gen Z. Those folks, I think that genres and release dates sometimes don't matter as much to them, maybe as they did to us when we were younger, because. Like she'll be listening to Woody Guthrie, and then something that came out last week or whatever. So it's like, I think sometimes it's more just about mixing and matching, which is part of that playlist culture. I think it's like, when you're trying to put together a playlist that's interesting, you pull it from everywhere, and if you're just recreating the top 40, that's not interesting. You can just do that. But, if you want to try to make something that's kind of cool, you have to pull from a lot of different piles, and that's something that I've always done.
It's a really broad palette out there.
Well, and I forget what the character's name is. The lady who kind of is more of like for lack of a better word, kind of the boss bitch, who like wants to. She doesn't want to just have the food truck. She wants to own the food court. Like she wants to like destroy the other the other trucks.
Exactly.
And there's definitely those people in the creative arts as well, who like it's about winning. And I thought that was a good.
Well, I felt that if I could, simplify these dynamics, and that's why the whole thing takes place in this this food truck lot, which I now find out you have experience performing in a place like this.
Especially when you had the guy
It's a very simple place. It's a simple place, and it's deceptive in its simplicity.
Right. Because there's dynamics.
What's going on there is complex human interactions. Yes.
Yeah. And everyone is in there for their own motivations. And you brought in also the musician guy, who is trying to break in and seize the food truck court as an opportunity, to kind of help his stars to shine a little bit. And that's definitely. I mean, again, I've actually lived that. Gone in there. I mean, not that I thought it was going to make me a big star or anything, but just like, hey, there's people in this food truck court. Let's play some tunes, And so,
sure. Well, I mean, why not?
It's the thing where my girlfriend is an artist, and there's a lot of cross-pollination between like the visual art scene and the music scene, and certainly also with the culinary, because of course, truthfully, there's a lot of musicians and artists who are working in food establishments, as their day jobs or night jobs, as it were, and so there can be an awful lot of crossover between the making of food and the, most of the places I play are either serving beverages or food or both. So it's kind of a combination experience, really, when you talk about cooking.
It is. And there's a symmetry there, and it's something of a metaphor, to talk about food, talk about art as if it's food.
Yeah.
Because,
it certainly is.
This whole idea that the artist makes it to feed the audience. I mean, it's really very similar, but it's more like this idea of like, it's just like a little like bento box of, emotion and insight, rather than, a literal plate of food. But,
right.
But there's, there's no question, like as an artist, this, you are whipping it up for them.
Right, and
you're making them a plate of something, yeah.
And the thing that Arjun has to come around to, and that I also have to come around to, is that sometimes people aren't going to like what you're doing. Like you're making it the best that you know how with the vision that you have for it, and there's some people who just aren't going to get it. And that's fine. And you can, make it, and you can hope that your people find you, and there are people who come to his truck like specifically for the thing that he makes. And,
Yes.
And it may not be as many people as, let's say some of the other trucks that are going on, but there's enough that are like, this thing is interesting and I'm going to come keep having this, and I've definitely had that in my career. So.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you kind of have to make decisions about that. And I would always, counsel anybody who's doing it, just follow the thing that you do. Don't worry about how accessible it is. Don't worry about how much people will like it. Do the thing you care about, the thing that matters to you.
Yeah.
Just do that.
Well,
it's really that simple.
Especially in the current environment where even if you are a very popular performer, sometimes those people aren't making ends meet either. There's been a bunch of talk lately about these people who've had big hits and who are now like, they can't tour because they just can't afford it, and because the logistics of, unless you're on a particular high shelf, trying to do the big rock star thing is just not cost effective anymore. And so if it's already that way, if you're only going to get $100 for, 1 million streams or whatever, then what's the sense in trying to kowtow? Because it used to be you'd be like, well, you want to filter it down to a level that's going to get onto radio and you're going to sell records. Well, if you're not selling records, if you're just selling streams, it's more difficult to see the logic in trying to dumb it down for a common denominator. To me, anyway.
Well, and also, I think that's a blessing in disguise for every artist, because over time, if you do dumb it down, if you do make compromises, if you do things to make it more accessible, you will love it less.
And that's the other thing.
And if you love it less, you will stop at some point because you don't know why you're even doing it.
Yeah.
But if you always don't do those things and you always just do what, you are driven to do, you will never stop.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And it's now, it really has been the thing I can't not do. But I did have a period, kind of in the mid to late 90s. I was actually trying pretty hard to sell out. And the more I did it, and the more it actually worked a little bit, like we were starting to get like the frat parties and stuff, the more I just absolutely started loathing it. And I was smart enough, I guess, to figure out, wait a minute, this is not why I got into this, was to hate people. So I dropped all that, and that was the genesis of the Matthew Show. Was like, no, this is just stuff I like, and I don't care if y'all like it or not. And what's interesting about that is when you do that, sometimes you do get people who are very responsive to that because they recognize that you're not trying to pander. And again, it's not going to be everybody, but it's going to be. It'll be enough that it'll make it interesting. And I'm kind of one of those where I've had people people who are in very much more mainstream type of genres, not because they're pandering, but just because that's just what they're into. Sometimes they kind of look at what I'm doing, they're kind of like, I kind of wish I could do that. Like, I wish I could just do whatever instead of just being like, this is what I sound like. But I think it's a bit of both, because I sound like I sound because that's just how I sound. So, I have this guy in my head who always sings my songs before I ever sing them. And because I hear him singing the melody, and then I have to recreate it with my own creaky ass voice. And I don't ever know.
Really?
Yeah. And I don't ever know who that guy is, but he comes up with some interesting melodies, and then I have to adapt them. But, I think somewhere in the process of taking it from that space and putting it into the meat and bones of, my hands and my voice, it's going to sound like me. There's just no, it's like, there's a friend of mine who, he likes to write these kind of space cowboy type of 60s hippie jams, but by the time he ends up singing them, they sound like country songs. And that's just because that's how he sounds. So,
right.
Yeah. And that's the same thing with me, like with my accent and my influences. it can start off in my head as a very Pink Floyd-y type affair, but it will end up being a little more rootsy than I had intended it to be, which again is not bad. It's just, it transmogrifies based on in the same way that your guitar sounds different based on what amp you're putting it through,
absolutely.
A song, well, like when I covered that Zevon song, right, I'm not going to sound like Warren Zevon because we just have different voices. So you have to approach it in a way that it makes sense for your voice to sing it. And that means, rigging it around a little bit. And every time I cover anything, I have to do that. I have to be like, all right, this is how it goes, but what's it like when I do it? And that takes some doing sometimes. And for one thing, I have to bring it down at least 5 steps because I have a lower voice. So just most pop songs I can't sing in their original key, which frustrates my band to no end because I go, hey, we're going to cover this. And they're like, yeah, but it's not going to be in the original key, is it? No, it's not. So I have to make charts for them and stuff.
But changing the key is almost always a good idea.
Well, yeah. And even the original artists often have to change the key. I went to go see Genesis in 2007 at Madison Square Garden. And even then, I mean, they had brought a lot of those songs down at least 2 steps, possibly 3. Because Phil's voice was getting a little iffy, and that happens. I went to see Billy Joel years ago. This has been 30 years ago, and he did An Innocent Man, and of course there's that one note, right?
Yes.
And he goes for that note, and he stops singing, and the backup singer sings that one note, and then he goes back to doing it. And at the end of the song, he goes, "What do you want me to do? I can't hit that note." So and that's been 30 years ago. Lord knows what he can hit now. But
you need to adapt sometimes.
Well, and also sometimes just changing stuff around can be useful. I read an interview years ago with a guy. His job was, like when a big band would release an album, his job was then to get together with them and figure out what the live versions of those songs sounded like, because they weren't going to sound exactly like the record. They needed to be optimized for live. So like they might have a longer intro, or maybe it's more sections where the band cuts out and the audience can sing along or something like that. So it's kind of an interesting way.
If a recorded song is organically created, there's just no way that replicating it live is going to make much sense. Right. And so what you have to do is there's a record version of a song. Yeah. And then there's a version that you do live that is a completely different thing that you created. Yeah. Yeah, it's the same song done in a totally different arrangement, and it's just, that's what, because I mean the context there is completely different, a record and a stage. Absolutely. Yeah. And so you got to just, know that. And so bands that go out and try to recreate a record, I mean, that's it's just,
I feel like that's
not going to work.
No, I feel like that's the wrong instinct, and I understand the pull. It'd be like, well, audience wants to hear it like they know it. But sometimes,
well, right. But then who's driving that train? Is the audience driving the train?
Yeah. Well, and also, again, it's not like you're going to sing it completely different. You're just going to add bits and subtract bits, and you're going to make it more dynamic. And I've changed stuff sometimes, like when we play tunes of mine from Texas, when we play those now, it's been 21 years since I put out that record. We play them differently, than we did back then, because we've played them so many times, and sometimes we go, hey, this would work if you do this, and why don't we try this little weird section here? Or sometimes somebody just does something, and then I go, hey, I like that, and we'll just keep it, But then,
okay, well, I do have one question. I have one question about that. The first thing that I heard by you, and it remains one of my very favorite things, and you know what I'm going to say. It is, Office Suite.
Yes, Office Suite.
And I remember hearing that like the first time, and like, all right, so who is this guy?
Yeah. Well, and
what is this? And I was just like loving it, and I listened to it quite a bit when it came out.
And you know what's funny about that one? I think it took me 2 hours to do that tune, like to write it and record it. Like it didn't take that long at all. I was just farting around. But what's interesting about that one is, so there were 2 Office Suites on that record. There's part 1 and part 2, and and uniformly, when the record came out and I sent it out for reviews, the reviews would come back and they would either like everything except the Office Suites, or they would like the Office Suites and nothing else. So
right.
they're very divisive pieces, and I'm happy to say that actually on this new record I'm doing part 3. So that'll be interesting.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, I figured it's time to bring it back. So
I just want to say that I like the fact that those are divisive pieces, and to me that's what made the record interesting, because either A, like you say, you need to have those on there for it all to make sense, or B, they don't belong there at all.
Right.
Yeah,
I almost didn't put them on.
But of course, A is the truth.
Yeah, I almost didn't put them on for that reason, because every time I'd show them to people, I'd be like, I don't know about that one, or somebody'd be like, yeah, that's the one, so it's you're either on one side or the other most of the time. But when we've done them live, of course, it sounds different, because it's not a dude playing his van and a ring on a table. Like it's, I have a drummer, so we do different stuff when we do it live. And you can't always play that everywhere. Like if you're playing, well, for instance, a food truck park, you can't be dropping the F-bombs every 5 seconds. So, it doesn't make it into every show. But
sure, you got to gauge the audience.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sensitive to that. I used to be a little more punk rock about it. Like, well, I don't give a fuck if they want to listen to it or not, But like, I'm a bit more like, you know what? This guy brought his kid to this place. He doesn't want to hear some guy ranting about his day job. So like, you make allowances. Maybe I got soft as a parent. But in the right crowd, absolutely. I'll drop that sucker like it's hot. But yeah, there's funny things about that. Well, and that's one of those things where like that came from me listening to shit like Dr. Demento and whatnot, where you never knew what was going to be next, right? Like he would play a Tom Waits song, and then he would play Weird Al, and then he would play La Love It, and then Nervous Norvus or whatever. Like it would, and to me, that's the spice. That's like keeping it interesting song by song. So it's not like, oh, song number 3 is basically song number 2 but slower. And
yeah,
I have to fight it sometimes, because my Achilles heel sometimes is I really, really, really love a 1-5-6-4 progression. Like I really, really love a 1-5-6-4 progression. But
right.
And most of my favorite songs of mine are a 1-5-6-4 progression. But I also know that like Taylor Swift uses a lot of 1-5-6-4, and like this, it's a popular progression. And so in my head, the way that I have to try to evolve is to somehow escape the 1-5-6-4. And I'm working on it. I've started throwing in like sharp 2 chords and stuff. So it's but but some things are kind of comfy like an old shoe, though. It's like when U2 started putting out the albums that didn't have Edge doing all the crazy delay stuff, And then eventually he was like, I'm turning the delay pedal back on. We were like, yeah, there you go.
Right.
So
everybody asked what happened to me. Yeah, exactly.
So, now I know you've, I barely even mentioned your musical output. So I know you kind of operate 2 outfits. You've got the Arms of Kismet and then the Water Slide.
Yes.
And I don't know. It feels like there was a more recent Water Slide album than the Arms of Kismet album in my head. I don't know if that's correct or not.
Yes.
And that came
Yeah,
out
the last Arms of Kismet was about in 18, and then I've had a couple EPs that came out as Water Slide after that.
Okay.
And
because that's
those
are the ones I've heard most
Arms of
recently.
Kismet is is kind of this this idea of kind of a refracted, kind of a shattered, refracted pop alternative band.
Yeah.
This idea that you kind of take what people expect and you just kind of break it up and reassemble it. And so it sounds kind of familiar and it's catchy, but it's also very, I think, a little bit, confrontational, conceptually speaking. And then, Water Slide is more like this kind of novels as record.
Yeah.
And so they're more these narratives, where you write songs and you tell a story.
And that's a good way to describe it. Because I had a hard time in my head figuring out exactly what the difference was, but you could hear it. You could definitely hear that one was coming from kind of a different place than the other one. And that's a good way to describe it.
Yeah, well, I wanted, to, kind of have a defined concept for each of them, because, a lot of people, it's just like, you could just, you just put out records under your name, and it's like,
right.
Well, yeah, man, I had an idea that I would do a Americana record, and then I had an idea that I would, do something jazzy, or,
right.
And it's just like, I'm very versatile and eclectic, but that is not necessarily very focused,
right.
In terms of trying to tell a story over time. And, I wouldn't say that you and I are young exactly.
No, certainly not.
but so we have some experience with time's passage, and with kind of coming to understand that. I mean, at some point I woke up and I said, "Oh, I get it. I'm not just working on this new album. I'm working on all of it."
Yeah.
This is, and so it's the whole thing. It's like however many albums it is when I'm done. That's the story.
And
it's not just one album. Yeah.
Right. Well, and to me, I think that also incorporates the prose as well, because, when you make a switch in medium from musical to written, it doesn't mean that flow of the story has stopped and then another one starts. You're actually, to me, it feels like it's just, this is a different chapter of the story.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
And so when I think of like your output and my output, I tend to think of them as kind of a big unit of like, this one happens to be musical, this one happens to be poetry, this one happens to be a story, but it's all part of the same body of work. And I don't tend to think of them as separate, because each of them has its own purpose to, for me at least, art is the way that I make sense of the universe, right? Because quite frankly, the universe doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I have to explain it to myself somehow. And so songs and stories, be they essays or whatever, those are kind of, that's me thinking out loud about like, okay, how do I explain this particular bit of life? And if you're lucky, there's somebody else out there who's trying to figure out that bit of life also, and you can compare notes, be like, okay, well, this was my experience. Yeah, okay, my experience was like that, but different. And you can kind of, that's what I like about listening to other people's songs, because you can find one that's kind of in the same wavelength, but they're coming from slightly different approaches. And of course, those are based on the fact that nobody lives life the same way. We're all born in different places to different people. We all pop out with different, environmental and or just the time you're born into too, and we get this little snippet of time and space where we get to describe what we see and what we observe. And there's no correct one as far as I can tell. There's just
yeah. No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's not like
there's 8 billion people on Earth. There are 8 billion points of view.
Right.
And 8 billion experiences and all of it.
Yeah, and that's what frustrates me sometimes is that you will have people who kind of like, well, no, life is this and it's nothing else. I'm kind of like, I feel like though that's the product of just not knowing enough people from different backgrounds. Because when I moved to New York, I mean, I grew up in a rural town in Texas, and moving to New York was exactly what I needed to do, which is to just experience the complete opposite of what I'd already experienced. Which
is great.
And that's what I wanted. I wanted it to shock and alarm me, and it did in many ways. But what it did was it put a big old dent in a lot of my assumptions about the world. Like, oh, well, most people are like this. Well, then you bump into a bunch of people who are not like that at all. And you have to, figure out, okay, so why is their experience so much different than mine? And the more you talk to them, the more you figure it out. That like, well, they've had very different things happen to them in very different environments that they had to adapt to. And everyone's perspective makes sense based, even people who come from where I came from, right? Well, there was a reason why I didn't understand a lot of things, experienced by minority groups, for instance, because I grew up in a town full of white people. So I had no idea, right? But then I got to experience what it was like being a minority, because I lived in a Hasidic neighborhood and I was the only non-Hasidic person there. And
oh, wow.
And it's interesting to walk around with everybody staring at you, like, what's this guy doing here?
Yeah.
Right. You kind of get a little glimpse of like, oh, and then I did the same thing. I was in a Puerto Rican neighborhood and I was one of the only non-Puerto Rican people. And yeah, people kind of, especially since I'm like about 4 feet taller than all of them, so I would kind of stick out a little bit. But
yeah, I mean, but that's great. That's a great experience, because you tend to remember what it's like to be on the receiving end of it.
Yeah, you're kind of like, oh wow, okay, so this is what happens when you walk into a neighborhood that ain't your neighborhood, and and then again, it's not necessarily a negative thing. It's like it's an adjustment thing. It's figuring out, okay, what goes here, what works here that doesn't work where I'm from. And one of the most shocking ones to me, the first night I was in that Hasidic neighborhood happened to be a Friday, which people who are Jewish will know why this is important. And I heard a tornado siren go off. Now in Texas, a tornado siren means only one thing. It means there's a freaking tornado coming. But in this part of Brooklyn, it meant the beginning of Shabbos. So, because the whole neighborhood was Jewish, so like they would just go ahead and sound this alarm to let everybody know, hey, stop working, stop doing all this time, and then it would go off again at sundown on Saturday. Well, but of course I was terrified. I was looking around, I was like, there's no tornadoes out here. Like I'm in the middle of Brooklyn. They don't have tornadoes in Brooklyn. So it's just different.
Well, I think you make a good point about meeting a lot of different kinds of people, collaborating with a lot of different people artistically, just trying a lot of different things. It's very similar to if you sit down and you start reading the classics.
Yeah.
And there are all these different authors, and you see all these different points of view. It's a very similar experience. Some of these things will enrich you or change you, and other ones maybe not so much. But
they might not be on your wavelength.
It's the exposure that brings about your growth.
Sometimes just even if you don't get it, right? Like even if it's not your thing, just having imbibed it, in one form or another, and gone, okay, this is not my thing, but I'm glad that I tried it. It's like having a meal that that you don't like. It's like, well,
exactly,
it was worth trying. Worth trying anyway. Even and I mean, I've had that. I've had people rave about authors to me, and like, oh, you should read so and so, and then I go read them. I'm like, I don't understand what's happening here. So, and then there's other people. I'm like, no, I totally get that. I know what you're talking about. So and that's why I don't really take it personally when somebody doesn't like what I do. I used to take it personally, but I don't anymore because I realize, first of all, it's completely impossible for everybody to like the same stuff.
But really, you know, whether or not they like it, you know, isn't really like maybe different language.
Yeah.
Like maybe they don't understand it.
Yeah, they either don't understand.
You know?
I tend to believe more. I tend to believe more in like we're all broadcasting on certain frequencies, and so if someone has got someone's on 92.7 and you're on 100.5, you know, I mean, you know, you'll pick it up, but it's not necessarily resonating on your same frequency. And there's been bands like that over the years where I've just been kind of like, I recognize that what they're doing very well, and I respect that they're doing what they're doing very well, but it does absolutely nothing for me. And I should be allowed to say that, you know, in the same way.
Well, of course, you know, I mean, of course, because you know that the reverse is also true.
Absolutely.
I mean, there are people out there that, you know, I mean, sometimes people put it this way, but they're like, they're your people. They're going to understand what you do just because they are predisposed to understanding it. Yeah. And there are inquisitive people that will just kind of stumble into your path that will be intrigued by something you've written or performing, and they will become your people.
Yeah, and I've had that happen. I'm glad over the years that I've had that happen because, you know, it can get kind of lonely sometimes, you know, kind of slaving away in your little garret, you know, putting stuff out, and you never do know when you put it out what the reception's going to be, and especially if you're trying something different. And but when you actually have done it enough times and you put it out, you realize somebody's going to like it, you know, even if it's not everybody. This new book actually, which I haven't mentioned yet, Shrail is a new book, and it's actually out now. It just came out on Friday. I didn't get a chance to promote it because I was in the car garage fixing my freaking alternator all day long. So I'm going to make a push about it next week. But I sent it to some test readers, and I did get a couple of them back going, man, I don't know. You know? And then I got some also back going, wow, this really, you know, this really spoke to me. And so I think it's going to be it's going to be one of those like the Office suites, you know. I think it's they're either going to like it or hate it, but at the very least you'll have a reaction of some kind.
well, you know, I mean, as somebody who has read it, you know, I will say that if a reader is you know, predisposed to abstract conceptual narrative, I think that it's, you know, something they might plug into. Yeah. But you know, but if they're more into like literal stuff, plot-driven stuff, it's probably a challenge. Right. You know, it's probably a challenge for that person.
And I get that totally because there's stuff, you know, there's stuff that's even too surreal for me, you know, and so I totally understand it. So that's one of those. When I used to work in the record store years ago, you keep in mind this is in the 1990s, so it was very high fidelity, right? And there were people who were, and I was one of them at the time, who was like, "No, this album sucks," and and anyone who likes this album also sucks. You know, I mean, there was very much that kind of, you know, absolutism that was happening, and.
It's totally silly, but
it is. But it's also like how very like, you know, young male that is. You know, that. Oh
yeah, I mean, it's a line in the sand. If you need a line in the sand at that point in your life, that's a good one. You know?
It's like, no, I'm sorry. Anybody who likes this album sucks. You know, so. But yeah, the older you get, and the more you kind of you realize, no, that. The people who like this don't suck. They just they're operating with a different bit of software, and it doesn't mean
exactly.
You know, and what I tend to try to focus on is like, well, is the thing well made? Is it well constructed? And if it is,
there you go.
Even if it's not my thing, I can still respect it. Because there's definitely
it's like every piece of art is like some part subjective, some part objective.
Right.
And the objective part, like quality is quality, and when something is well made and well conceived, that is quality.
Right. Yeah.
You know.
Even if it's not my thing.
Taste. The rest is taste. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of the nuanced world that I've lived in since then, and but it took a while to get to, you know. because to me, and I don't think I would have started making music at all if music weren't sort of a moral pursuit to me as well, because I grew up largely in the 80s, and there was a lot of crap on the radio, and and I was very much of the mindset of like, no, we must fight the crap. We must battle the purveyors of the crap to put out something good. And what's interesting about that years later, of course, is sometimes I listen to some of those same songs that I thought were crap. And now I'm kind of hearing some of the bits of production artistry, where I'm kind of like, oh, well, that was an interesting thing to do right there, and with a producer's ear. Now I'm kind of appreciating some of these things that maybe I wouldn't have appreciated at the time, because all I knew was that the people I didn't liked it, and I felt like it was too simplistic and a lot of the stuff. There is a lot of pop music that is very simplistic lyrically, but sometimes you don't need it to be complicated, right? Sometimes it can just be a goofy little rant over a little guitar line or something, and. So I'm a lot less judgmental than I was, back then, but I also am a connoisseur of quality, in that, if I feel something is way too plug and play, like somebody just turned on preset 1 and preset 5 and kind of let it go, I'll kind of be like, work a little harder,
right.
Work a little harder, guys, because I'm pretty, having worked with a lot of this stuff, I'm pretty good at spotting it. I'm kind of like, okay, I know where they got that from. And, there's a certain amount of borrowing, I think, that's good. And then there's the kind of borrowing that's lazy borrowing. And I'm kind of the Lyle Lovett school of go for the least likely rhyme. Because a lot of times you're listening to songs and you hear the end of a phrase and you go, okay, I know what the last word of the next phrase is going to be. They're going to pick the easy rhyme. And what I always liked about his work and Tom Waits and people like that was that they don't go for the obvious rhyme. They go for some rhyme that's just off the path. And to me, that's a worthy goal to do that.
Oh, yeah.
Because
obviously, when you're making like original art, you're making original records. It's up to you to determine what about it is going to be different.
Yeah.
And it's not really okay, like you say, to kind of, be lazy and give people what they expect. Because giving people what they expect, I think that's actually one of the worst things that you can do as an artist.
Yeah, I think so too.
Because if you give them what they expect, you're actually giving them what they've already had.
Right.
It's nothing, and it's not going to enlighten them or illuminate anything for them. It's not going to make them feel different about life in any way. So you need to give them something surprising.
Yeah.
It's just in some way surprising. It doesn't have to be alien, but, something that is surprising.
Yeah.
That, brings this thing that I guess is normally called delight.
Right.
when a person receives the thing in the art and they just are delighted, that is victory.
Yeah. See, there we go. And right. Well, and this is kind of an odd segue, but I was recently rereading Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, and so one of the endless is delirium, right? But delirium used to be delight. And then delight turned into delirium. And I think when I'm looking at the modern music landscape, sometimes I'm like, I feel like delight is being replaced with delirium. Like it's kind of there's a lot of what I feel is kind of it's machine frequencies that are being put out rather than human frequencies. And and to me, that kind of creates a sameness in our experiences that I think stagnates us a bit. And I think that part of why a lot of us find ourselves in kind of a claustrophobic headspace sometimes is that there's a lot of sameness. You drive into any town and there's a Taco Bell, there's a Chipotle, you kind of. there's a lot of the same stuff, and you can get the same TV programs everywhere. You can get a lot of this stuff is standardized, and I feel like the food truck, for instance, you have to try to throw some wabi-sabi in there somewhere, or it's going to be
right.
or everything's just going to be the same, and that I feel like is something that the internet. I had a lot of high hopes for the internet back when it was relatively new to me, anyway, in the early aughts, and I feel like that whole dead internet thing, where it's kind of bots talking to bots, and it's kind of driven me a little more back into the analog world a little bit, frankly. I sometimes feel as if I'm not even talking to people half the time, and
unfortunately, it's getting worse.
Yeah, and
it clearly is getting worse.
Yeah, so I don't know what the solution to that is, because I'm not nearly wise enough to deduce all of that. But in closing, I want to thank you for being on the show. Make sure, is it yours? This is basically available everywhere, right? Deep Fried,
It's called Deep Fried, and
Mark Doyon.
It is a novel, and it is Doyon, Mark Doyon, and it's it's a pretty breezy read for those that are ready for it. Yeah,
I think it's a good, everybody's going to their in-laws and whatnot for Thanksgiving. Bring a copy of this with you, so if you need to escape to a back room and kind of get away from the madness, this is a good book for that. To kind of sink in yourself.
Well, thank you, because I think that's probably one of the very best things, very best ways to use it. Yeah.
Is to escape from family trauma and things of that nature. Thanks so much for being on the show, man. And I look forward to seeing what you get up to next. Where do they find you on the interwebs?
Well, markdoyon.com, armsofkismet.com, and of course, the label, wampus.com.
Yeah. Fantastic.
And, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it, and, anytime.
All right. Thanks, man. I'll talk to you later.
Take care, Matthew. Bye-bye.
This program is brought to you by Naive Media. Visit thematthewshow.com for info on this and other programs.